Indigenous Circle of Experts and their work stems back to 2010, when the 10th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity set out a plan, a set of 20 global biodiversity targets called the ICE targets, to try to determine how we can make some significant progress around conservation and protection of biodiversity moving forward towards where we are now in 2020. And so when those targets were adopted, Canada took a few of the targets and decided to make those targets their priority moving forward here domestically. And they took target 11 of the ICE targets, of the global targets, and set out a goal of protecting at least 17% of terrestrial areas and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas through networks of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. And so when that work was undertaken, it was called the Pathway to Canada Target 1. And the ICE, the Indigenous Circle of Experts, was established as an advisory body to that initiative to provide guidance on what this would mean for Indigenous peoples in Canada, and what it would mean for relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians around conservation and biodiversity. For about a year, the Indigenous Circle of Experts worked together, traveling across the country, visiting a great many Indigenous nations and communities, and just worked really intensively to come up with a report with recommendations and guidance provided to the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative regarding how to understand the role and responsibilities of Indigenous peoples across Canada vis-a-vis conservation and protection of biodiversity, and to further articulate this concept or approach called Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas, which of course pre-existed the work of the ICE in other fields, but definitely was something that the ICE took and elaborated a little bit more in depth in the Canadian context.
The Indigenous Circle of Experts was a practice in what I would call true reconciliation. We had half of our members were Indigenous innovators from across the country, and the other half were government employees from federal, provincial, and territorial governments, again from across Canada. And so strong relationships were built across the committee, and it was a unique moment, I think, in Canadian history. And so the ICE committee provided its recommendations for the Pathway to Target 1, but we also affected one another's lives and inspired others across Canada that there is an alternative way to go about conserving nature that can involve a genuine effort in reconciliation. And I'm always reminded of the quote from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that says that reconciliation between Crown and Indigenous peoples can never happen until there's reconciliation with the land. And this harkens back to the original peace and friendship treaties that were the original multilateral environmental agreements that said that we promised to live in peace and friendship with one another as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines. So there's that connection of Euro-Indigenous relations that's anchored in a respectful relationship with the land.
for me, the most fundamental aspects of what was proposed in the We Rise Together report, the final report of the ICE, were, number one, that we wanted to elevate Indigenous systems to a position of equity with the written Western, I guess you might say, or scientific knowledge systems that were being used in sort of the status quo management and governance of existing conserved and protected areas. IPCAs for us was really about creating that space once more for Indigenous systems to function with integrity in a way that that really honored what it is that those systems have to offer in terms of bringing balance back into the environment. The second prong of what I felt was really important in our report was the articulation of our vision around Indigenous protected and conserved areas, where fundamentally we really conceptualized it as really being Indigenous led. And part of that was sort of a reaction to the long histories that we have in Canada and internationally of places and spaces being conserved and protected, where Indigenous peoples and their practices are considered to be disruptive to that conservation and protection as opposed to being aspects of it.
Something special was started with the work of the ICE committee, and the Pathway to Canada Target 1 provided the opportunity for that to happen. And we want to continue that work. 4 of the 6 Leadership Council members are, alumni ICE members, and we have all very much kept alive our relationships and our connection to the work of the ICE. And so as we move forward with the CRP, I think it's really key for partners and for the general learning community to understand that connection, that we're still, following our self-determination and taking care of the responsibilities that we feel that we have the ability to satisfy and ensure that work gets done. In the early days of the work of the Indigenous Circle of Experts, there was a due diligence process that was undertaken, calling out the elephants in the room and what are the unavoidable conversations that we're going to have. And one of those elephants, which eventually transformed into moose and became the characters in the 4 Moose narrative, one of those moose is capacity development. And so while we were in mid-stride in collecting information for our report, we saw that this was an important aspect to get underway right away. And so the application for the CRP came from that interest that we had to ensure that we hit the ground running for capacity development in terms of supporting Indigenous governments to establish, govern, and manage their own IPCAs.
The CRP sort of came about because of the work that ICE was engaged in. When we went through the process of finalizing, our report and submitting it in March of 2018, there was a real sense on the part of the ICE, in particular the Indigenous members of the ICE, that we really wanted to ensure that there was a lot of momentum moving forward, and not just in sort of a singular way, i.e. through the transfer of our report and recommendations to the Pathway to Canada Target 1 initiative, but also that we wanted the work to resonate in various ways, and really to have a ripple effect. And that's where the CRP came in.